This baby was found by a millionaire on the windshield of his car, but before he could relax, he discovered the baby was about to die. But unfortunately, 2 days later, something shocking happens. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to support my work. The rain poured relentlessly over Chicago that winter night, turning the streets into dark and lonely rivers. Richard Sterling adjusted the rearview mirror of his red Porsche, trying to focus on the blurred city lights. His fingers drummed nervously on the leather steering wheel as he tried to process the disastrous meeting he'd just had with his investors. Years of hard work building his real estate empire seemed to melt like ice under the scorching sun of the financial problems that now haunted him. The traffic was surprisingly light for a Thursday night, allowing his thoughts to wander dangerously into dark territories. The harsh words of his accountant still echoed in his mind. "Mr. Sterling, if we continue at this rate, in 6 months we could lose everything." The possibility of seeing his empire crumble left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. Richard had always been known for his impeccable posture and his characteristic arrogance. At 42 years old, he had built one of the largest construction companies in the city, practically from scratch. His name was synonymous with success, and he made a point of displaying it in every detail of his life, from the imported car to the custom-made Italian suit he wore. A red light forced him to stop on a particularly deserted street. The rain continued to fall heavily, creating a curtain of water that distorted the reality around him. It was then that something unusual caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just a strange reflection on the windshield, but there was something different, something that shouldn't be there. Richard narrowed his eyes, trying to see better through the torrential rain. His heart began to beat faster when he realized there was a strange lump on the hood of his car. Without thinking twice, he braved the storm and got out of the vehicle. What he found there made his blood run cold. Lying on the soaked glass was a baby, no more than 2 months old. His little face was swollen and pale, marked by deep dark circles that shouldn't exist in such a small child. The child's breathing was shallow and irregular, as if each breath required a monumental effort. With trembling hands, Richard picked up the baby in his arms. The child was freezing, his thin clothes completely soaked by the relentless rain. In the small hand clenched in a fist, there was a crumpled and damp piece of paper. Richard carefully opened it, feeling his heart stop. As he read the words written in shaky handwriting, "He has 48 hours to live." The businessman looked around desperately, searching for any sign of who could have left the child there. But the street was completely deserted. The baby in his arms let out a weak whimper, so fragile that it could barely be heard under the sound of the rain. Without thinking twice, Richard ran back to the car, protecting the small body with his own jacket. He turned the heater on full blast, and with his heart racing drove as fast as he could towards the nearest hospital. At each traffic light, he cast anxious glances at the passenger seat, where the baby lay, his breathing becoming increasingly difficult. The way to the hospital seemed endless. Richard, who had always prided himself on maintaining control in any situation, felt completely lost. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he tried to keep the car on the road, dividing his attention between the traffic and the child next to him. When he finally arrived at the emergency room of Mercy Hospital, Richard practically burst through the doors of the emergency room, carrying the baby in his arms. "Please, help! He needs help!" His voice, normally controlled and authoritative, now came out muffled and desperate. The medical team acted quickly, taking the baby to an emergency room. Richard stood in the hallway, soaked and stunned, watching through the glass as doctors and nurses worked frantically around the small, motionless figure on the stretcher. After what seemed like an eternity, a doctor came out of the room. Her face was grave as she addressed Richard. "His condition is critical. He is severely dehydrated and malnourished. The next few hours will be crucial." She paused, studying the businessman's expression. "Are you the father?" Richard shook his head negatively, still in shock. He quickly explained how he had found the baby, handing the doctor the wet note. She examined the paper with a worried expression. "I'll need to call social services," she said. "But first, we need to stabilize him. Do you intend to stay?" Richard looked through the glass at the baby, now connected to various machines and tubes. Something inside him contracted as he saw that small and fragile being fighting for his life. Without hesitation, he replied, "Yes, I'll stay." The doctor nodded and returned to the emergency room. Richard remained there, watching the movements of the medical team, feeling an anguish he had never experienced before. In his mind, a single question echoed endlessly. Who would be capable of abandoning a child in that way, and why had that enigmatic note been left specifically? In his car, the hours dragged on in the hospital corridor as Richard remained seated in an uncomfortable chair, still with his wet clothes clinging to his body. His eyes did not leave the small window that overlooked the neonatal ICU, where the baby was fighting for his life. Every time a doctor or nurse entered the room, his heart would race, fearing bad news. The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, had arrived a short time ago and was bombarding him with questions that he could barely process. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages from his secretary about important meetings he was missing. But for the first time in his life, Richard didn't care about business. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah called for the third time, finally getting his attention. "I need you to tell me exactly how you found the baby. Every detail could be important." Richard took a deep breath, running his hands over his tired face. He described again the moment he saw the small bundle on his car, the threatening note, the desperate race to the hospital. As he spoke, a nurse came out of the ICU with a worried expression, making his heart leap. "He's having seizures," the nurse reported quickly, before running to get more medication. Richard jumped up, pressing his face against the glass of the ICU. The tiny little body was shaking violently, while the doctors worked frantically around him. The machines began to beep deafeningly, and Richard felt his legs weaken. It was then that a woman appeared in the hallway. Her grey hair was tied in a messy bun, and her simple clothes contrasted with the hospital environment. "I was told you found an abandoned baby," she said, her hoarse voice filled with concern. "My name is Beverly. I think I can help." Sarah, the social worker, immediately approached her. "Do you have any information about this child?" Beverly wrung her hands, nervously, looking from Richard to the social worker. "I take care of abandoned children at the Hope Center. I have a small community daycare." She hesitated, as if weighing each word. "In recent months, I've been following a young mother. She wasn't doing well." Richard approached, feeling he might finally find some answers. "Do you know who this baby's mother is?" Beverly stared at him with a disturbing intensity. "You're Richard Sterling, aren't you? The businessman?" He nodded, confused by the question. Beverly's face paled even further. "My God. Then it's true," she murmured. "Clara, she really did it." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Clara? Clara Sterling?" "Yes," confirmed Beverly. "Your ex-wife." The world seemed to spin around Richard. Clara. He hadn't seen her in almost a year since their tumultuous divorce. She had disappeared completely, cutting off contact with everyone. And now, "That's impossible," he stammered. "Clara she wouldn't do that." "You don't know how she became after you separated," Beverly said, her voice filled with sadness. "She'd been battling her demons for a long time, but afterwards it got much worse." Memories flooded Richard's mind like a whirlwind. Clara had always been a complex woman, with emotional ups and downs that he never really understood. During their marriage, there were times when she would shut down completely, spending days practically without speaking. He attributed it to stress, the pressure of being the wife of an important businessman. Now he realized how blind he had been. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," replied Beverly. "She appeared at the daycare 3 months ago, pregnant and desperate. I helped as much as I could, but she refused to seek professional help. After the baby was born, she started having strange ideas. She said he was cursed, that he wouldn't live more than 2 days." A scream from the ICU interrupted the conversation. The baby was having another seizure, stronger than the previous one. Doctors were running back and forth, and Richard could see the small body arching in the incubator. "Please," he pleaded to Beverly, "I need to know everything. Where does she live? How can I find her?" Beverly hesitated. "She's living in a small room in the back of Mrs. Johnson's house, near the daycare. But Mr. Sterling, she's not well. In recent weeks, it's gotten much worse. She started writing strange notes, sticking them all over the house. She talked to herself, didn't sleep." Dr. Miller, the doctor who had initially attended the baby, approached the group with a grave expression. "We managed to stabilize him for now, but the situation is very worrying. We need to know if there's a history of diseases in the family, if the mother took any medication during pregnancy." "She was taking several medications," Beverly informed. "I tried to convince her to see a doctor, but she said the old medications still worked. She kept several boxes under the bed." Richard felt his blood run cold. Clara had always been resistant to seeking psychiatric help, preferring to self-medicate with old prescriptions. During the marriage, he had tried to convince her several times to seek proper treatment, but she always reacted badly. "I need to go there," he decided. "I need to find her." "I'll go with you," Beverly offered. "She trusts me, more or less." Sarah, the social worker, intervened. "We need to document this whole situation. The police—" "No," Richard interrupted. "No police. Clara is sick. She needs help, not punishment." A new alarm sounded in the ICU. The baby was having another crisis. Richard looked at the small being fighting for his life and made his decision. Turning to Beverly, he said, "Take me to her. Now." As they walked down the hallway, Richard felt the weight of guilt crush his chest. How hadn't he noticed before? How had he let Clara get to this point? She had always been a fragile woman, and he, in his arrogance and obsession with work, had abandoned her when she needed him most. The baby, his son, was dying, and Clara was lost somewhere, alone with her demons. The rain was still falling outside, but Richard barely noticed. In his mind, there was only room for one certainty. He needed to fix this. He needed to save them both, even if it meant facing all the ghosts he had tried to bury after the divorce. Richard's car snaked through the narrow streets of the Hope Center neighborhood, with Beverly indicating the way. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the darkness of the night made it difficult to identify the house numbers. The simple neighborhood, with its modest buildings and poorly lit streets, was a world completely different from the luxurious environment to which Richard was accustomed. "It's here," said Beverly, pointing to a yellowish house with a small iron gate. "Clara lives in the back." Richard parked and got out of the car, feeling his heart pound in his chest. The path to the back of the house was narrow, poorly lit by a weak lamp that flickered erratically. Beverly went ahead, greeting Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who watched them with curiosity from the window of the main house. When they reached the door of the small room in the back, Richard felt his stomach churn. The place was tiny, smaller than his closet. A small window let in the yellow light from the street lamp, revealing a scene that left him in shock. The walls were covered In papers, dozens, maybe hundreds of handwritten notes in a shaky and irregular handwriting that he immediately recognized as Clara's. Some were just loose words, others were complete sentences, but they all seemed to scream a silent despair that made Richard feel dizzy. 2 days. Only 2 days. He won't survive. I need to save him. Why doesn't anyone believe? Me? The notes repeated, some more recent than others, creating a macabre tapestry of anguish and fear. In the center of the room, a small bed was unmade, and on it, several boxes of medicines were scattered. Richard picked up one of them with trembling hands. The prescription date was 3 years ago. "Clara," he called softly, his voice failing. There was no answer. "She must be at the daycare," said Beverly, her voice filled with concern. "Sometimes. She goes there at night, when she can't sleep." Richard continued examining the room, each detail revealing more about the deteriorated mental state of his ex-wife. In one corner, he found a small cardboard box with some baby clothes, all folded meticulously. Next to it, an open notebook showed obsessive notes about feeding and sleep schedules, interspersed with confused drawings and scribbled words. "How didn't I notice?" he murmured, more to himself than to Beverly. "How did I let this happen?" "She hid it well," Beverly replied softly, "even from me, who was trying to help. I only realized how bad it was when she started talking about the curse." "What curse?" Clara was convinced that the baby wouldn't live more than 2 days. She said she had dreamed about it, that it was a warning. She started hearing voices that confirmed this idea. I tried to convince her to seek help, but she said no one would understand. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of years of neglect. He remembered the times when Clara had tried to talk about her fears, her anxieties, and he, always busy with work, had minimized her feelings. "It's just nerves," he used to say. "It will pass." A noise at the door made them turn. Clara was standing in the doorway, her too thin body trembling slightly. Her eyes, always so expressive, now seemed opaque and distant. She had deep, dark circles, and her hair, once always styled, was tangled and lifeless. "Richard!" Her voice was just a whisper. You found him." He stood up slowly, fearing to scare her. "Yes, Clara, I found our son." Her eyes filled with tears. "I knew you would find him. Only you could save him. The voices said he would have a better chance if he was with you." "Clara," Richard took a step towards her, "he's very sick. We need to know what medications you took during pregnancy. The doctors need this information." She began to shake her head frantically. No, you don't understand. It's not the medications. It's the curse. He only has 2 days. It was always only 2 days. "There's no curse," Richard said, trying to keep his voice calm as he approached. "Our son is sick, but we can help him. Together." Clara recoiled until she hit the wall, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't believe me. No one believes me. But I know, I saw. Every night I see." Beverly tried to approach. "Clara, honey, let's go to the hospital. You need to see the baby." "No!" Clara's scream was so sudden that both were startled. "I can't see him. If I see him, it will happen faster." The voices said. She slid down the wall until she sat on the floor, hugging her knees. She began to murmur something incomprehensible, rocking back and forth. Richard felt his heart break seeing the state she was in. He knelt beside her, ignoring the fear of her reaction. "Clara, look at me. It's me, Richard. Remember when we met? You said I was too arrogant for my own good. You were right. I was arrogant and blind. I didn't see how much you were suffering, how much you needed help. But now I'm here. Let me help, please." Clara looked up slowly, and for a moment Richard saw a glimmer of the woman he had known, strong, determined, full of life. But soon her eyes clouded over again. "The medications," she said, her voice trembling. They're under the bed. All of them. I wrote down when I took them. I had to take them. The voices wouldn't stop if I didn't take them. Richard reached under the bed and pulled out a shoebox full of pill packs and a notebook with detailed notes. His stomach churned, seeing the amount of different medications. Beverly's phone rang, breaking the tense silence. She answered, and her face paled. "It's from the hospital," she said, handing the phone to Richard. "The baby is having another crisis." Richard took the phone with trembling hands, hearing the urgent voice of Dr. Miller. The baby had had another severe seizure, and his vital signs were deteriorating rapidly. They needed the information about the medications immediately. He looked at Clara, who had now returned to murmuring to herself, lost in her own world of shadows and voices. The box of medications in his hands could hold the key to saving his son, but it was also the painful evidence of how much Clara had suffered alone. "I'm going to take her to the hospital," he decided, putting the medications in a bag. "She needs professional help." But when he turned to Clara, she was no longer there. The back door was open, and the sound of hurried footsteps in the rain indicated that she had fled. Richard ran out of the small room, feeling the fine drizzle wet his face as he tried to locate Clara in the darkness. Beverly pointed in one direction. "The daycare! She always goes there when she's scared." They ran through the narrow streets of the Hope Center neighborhood, Richard holding the bag with the medications firmly while trying not to lose Beverly in sight. The older woman, despite her age, knew every alley and shortcut in the neighborhood. After a few minutes, they stopped in front of a simple house with a small garden in front. A faded sign identified the place as Sunny Corner Daycare. The lights were off, but the front door was ajar. Richard felt his heart clench as he entered the place. It was a simple but welcoming environment, with children's drawings on the walls and small colored tables scattered around the main room. In one corner, there was an empty crib with a blue blanket folded carefully. "This is where she spent most of her time," Beverly whispered. She took care of the children, as if they were her own. She had a special way with them. A low sob caught their attention. Following the sound, they found Clara huddled in a corner of the baby room, clutching a teddy bear. The scene broke Richard's heart. She seemed so small, so fragile, so different from the strong and determined woman he had known years ago. "Clara," he called softly, approaching slowly. "We need to go to the hospital. Our son needs you." She looked up, her eyes red from crying so much. "He's going to die, Richard, like all the others." "Others?" he asked, confused. Beverly cleared her throat, hesitant. She had 2 miscarriages before when you were still married. Did you know?" Richard felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. No, he didn't know. How didn't he know? Clara had never mentioned, or had she, and he was too busy to listen. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked, his voice muffled. "You were always so busy," Clara replied, her voice distant. "Meetings, trips, business, and I didn't want to be another problem. I was already felt too weak for not being able to hold the babies." Her words were like knives in his chest. He remembered the times when Clara had tried to talk, and he had quickly dismissed it with a "we'll talk later" or "not now, I'm busy." How many pains had she kept? How many fears had she faced alone? "I lost both in the second month," she continued, stroking the teddy bear distractedly. "The voices started after the second one. They said I didn't deserve to be a mother, that any baby I had would die in 2 days. I tried not to believe it. I tried so hard. But then I dreamed about this baby. I saw him dying, Richard. I saw it so clearly." Richard's phone rang, making everyone jump. It was the hospital again. He answered quickly, hearing the urgent voice of Dr. Miller. The baby was getting worse. His organs were starting to fail. They needed that information about the medications immediately. "Clara," he said, kneeling in front of her, "listen to me. Our son is alive. He's fighting to live, but he needs our help. I need to know exactly what medications you took during pregnancy, each one of them." She began to shake her head frantically. I can't. If I tell you, it will happen faster." The voices said, "What voices, Clara? What voices are these that make you so sick, that made you believe you don't deserve to be happy, to be a mother?" "They're always here," she pointed to her own head. "They started after I lost the second baby. At first they were whispers, then they got louder. They told me what to do, what medications to take." Richard picked up the bag with the medications and started taking out the boxes one by one. These medications were the voices that told you to take them. Clara looked at the medications as if they were snakes ready to strike. "They said I needed them, that if I didn't take them it would be worse, that the babies would die faster." Beverly, who had been silently watching the scene, approached gently. "Clara, honey, do you trust me?" The young woman nodded slightly. "Then believe me when I say that these voices are lying. They don't want to help you, they want to hurt you, and they're hurting your baby too." Beverly's words seemed to hit something in Clara. She looked at the teddy bear in her hands, then at Richard, and finally at the medications scattered on the floor. I wrote everything down," she said softly, almost in a whisper. "In the blue notebook, each medication, each hour. I had to be very precise, otherwise the voices would scream louder." Richard picked up the notebook that was with the medications and opened it. Page after page of meticulous notes, showing a frightening routine of self-medication. Some medications she took 3-4 times a day. It was a dangerous combination of antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, and mood stabilizers, all in high doses. "My God, Clara," he murmured, feeling the tears escape his eyes. "How did I let this happen? How didn't I notice?" She looked at him, and for the first time that night, her eyes seemed truly focused. "It wasn't your fault, Richard. I hid it well. I always hid it. Since I was little, I learned that being strong meant not showing weakness." Another ring of the phone interrupted the moment. It was Dr. Miller again, her voice even more urgent. The baby was going into multiple organ failure. They needed to act fast. "Clara," Richard said, holding her hands in his, "our son needs us now. He needs his mother. Come with me to the hospital. Let's fight for him together." She looked at their joined hands, then at the teddy bear, and finally at the bag with the medications. For a long moment she was silent, as if fighting an internal battle against the voices that tormented her. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "But Richard, what if we can't save him? What if the voices are right?" "Then we'll face it together," he replied, helping her to stand up. "I won't leave you alone. Ever again, Clara, never again." As they left the daycare, with Beverly following them closely, Richard knew that the battle was far from over. The baby was still fighting for his life in the hospital, and Clara would need a lot of support to overcome her internal demons. But for the first time that endless night, he felt a small flame of hope ignite in his chest. The trip to the hospital was silent and tense. Richard drove as fast as he could, while Clara remained motionless in the passenger seat, clutching the teddy bear she had brought from the daycare. Beverly had stayed behind, promising to arrive later with some clothes and personal items for Clara. When they entered the emergency room of the hospital, Dr. Miller was waiting for them with a grave expression. "The situation has worsened significantly," she informed, leading them quickly through the corridors. "We need to know exactly what medications were administered to start the appropriate treatment." Richard handed the blue notebook and the bag with the medications to the doctor, who began to examine Clara's meticulous notes. As she read, her expression became increasingly worried. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, addressing Clara with a gentle but firm voice. This combination of medications is extremely dangerous, especially during pregnancy. Some of them can cause serious damage to the baby's development. Clara began to tremble, hugging the teddy bear tighter. I had to take them. The voices wouldn't stop if I didn't take them. They screamed so much. The doctor exchanged a meaningful look with Richard before continuing. I understand you were going through a very difficult time, but now we need to focus on helping your son. He's very fragile and we need to act quickly. She led them to the neonatal ICU, stopping in front of the incubator where the little one was fighting for his life. Clara, seeing her son for the first time since she had left him in Richard's car, let out a low moan of anguish. The baby was even paler than before, his tiny body connected to various tubes and machines. The heart monitor emitted irregular beeps, and his breathing was visibly labored. He's suffering, Clara whispered, tears streaming silently down her face. It's all my fault. The voices were right. I don't deserve to be a mother. Richard hugged her, feeling her tremble against his chest. Don't talk like that. You're sick, Clara. You need help just like our son needs it. But we'll face this together. Dr. Miller returned, accompanied by 2 other doctors. We need to start an aggressive treatment immediately, she explained. The combination of medications has affected several of the baby's organs, especially the kidneys and liver. We are going to try a series of procedures to eliminate the toxins from his system. Is he going to survive? Clara asked, her voice almost inaudible. The doctor hesitated for a moment. The next few hours will be critical. We will do everything in our power, but we need you to understand the seriousness of the situation. At that moment, Sarah, the social worker, appeared accompanied by a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Dr. Bennett, a psychiatrist at the hospital. Mrs. Sterling, he said gently, we need to talk about your treatment as well. From what I'm seeing in your notes, you are having a severe psychotic episode. We need to admit you to stabilize your condition. Clara clung tighter to Richard. No, I can't leave my baby. If I leave, he'll... Clara, Richard interrupted softly. You need to get treated. It's the only way you can help our son. But the voices, they said that if I walked away... The voices are lying, said Dr. Bennett firmly. They are part of your illness. They are not real. Your son needs a healthy mother, and for that, you need to accept help. Clara looked once more at the incubator where the baby continued his silent fight for life. Her eyes were watery when she turned to Richard. Do you promise you'll stay with him, that you won't leave him alone for even a minute? I promise, Richard replied, feeling his own heart break. I won't leave his side. Clara nodded slowly, allowing Dr. Bennett to guide her out of the ICU. Before leaving, however, she stopped and turned to Richard. He needs a name, she said. We can't let him fight without a name. Richard thought for a moment, remembering all the stories his grandmother used to tell about strength and perseverance. Noah, he said. Let's call him Noah. A small smile appeared on Clara's face, the first Richard had seen all night. Noah, she repeated softly. It's perfect. After Clara was taken to the psychiatric ward, Richard turned his attention to his son. He pulled a chair close to the incubator and sat down, determined to keep his promise. The medical team worked tirelessly over the next hours. Noah underwent a series of procedures to try to cleanse his system of the toxic medications. Every time the alarms went off, Richard felt his heart stop. Beverly arrived a few hours later, bringing a bag with clothes for Clara and a small bundle for Richard. I found this in her room, she said, handing him a crumpled envelope. I think you should read it. Richard opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter written in Clara's irregular handwriting. Richard, if you're reading this, it means you found our son. I know you must hate me now, and you have every right to. What I did is unforgivable. But I need you to understand. I couldn't take the voices anymore. The constant fear, the certainty that our baby would die like the others. You have always been so strong, so sure of yourself. Even when you were wrong, you had a confidence that I envied. That's why I put him in your car. If anyone can save him, it's you. Forgive me for never telling you about the other babies. Forgive me for being weak, for not being able to be the wife you deserved. Forgive me for letting the disease win. Take care of our son. Give him all the love that I didn't know how to give. Clara. Richard held the letter to his chest. The tears finally running freely down his face. How had he been so blind? How hadn't he realized how much Clara was suffering? A sharp alarm tore him from his thoughts. Noah's monitors began to beep frantically, and a team of doctors and nurses invaded the ICU. "He's going into shock," someone shouted. Richard was pushed out of the ICU, where he stood watching helplessly as the team struggled to stabilize his son. Through the glass, he could see Noah's tiny body being shaken by violent seizures. "Please," he murmured, not knowing exactly to whom he was praying. "Please, don't take my son. I can't lose him too." The next hours were the longest of his life. With each new alarm, with each new procedure, Richard felt as if a piece of his heart was being torn away. All he could do was wait and hope that his little warrior would continue fighting. Dawn dragged on at the hospital, each minute feeling like an eternity. Richard remained seated in the ICU hallway, his eyes fixed on the door through which the doctors were constantly entering and leaving. His clothes were still damp from the rain, but he barely noticed the discomfort. All his attention was focused on the sounds coming from inside the unit. Each beep of the machines, each movement of the medical team made his heart jump. Beverly had gone to see Clara in the psychiatric ward and returned with a worried look. They had to sedate her, she informed in a low voice. She was very agitated, saying she could hear the baby crying in the hallways. Richard ran his hands over his tired face. The image of Clara being taken to the psychiatric ward did not leave his mind. The fear in her eyes, the way she hugged the teddy bear as if it were her last connection to reality. How hadn't he realized before how sick she was? Dr. Miller came, out of the ICU, looking as exhausted as he did. "We managed to stabilize him for now," she said, sitting next to Richard. "But the situation is still very serious. The tests show that the medications have caused significant damage to the kidneys and liver." "What can we do?" asked Richard, his voice hoarse from crying so much. "We are doing a blood cleaning to try to eliminate the toxins, but it is a delicate procedure in such a small baby," explained the doctor. "Every hour that passes is crucial. If we can keep him stable in the next 24 hours, his chances increase considerably." Sarah, the social worker, approached with a stack of documents. "Mr. Sterling, we need to resolve some legal issues," she said gently. "Since you and Mrs. Sterling are divorced, we need to establish temporary custody of the baby while she is admitted." Richard nodded mechanically, signing the papers without really reading them. His thought was divided between Noah fighting for his life in the ICU, and Clara, alone in a room in the psychiatric ward. Dr. Bennett, the psychiatrist, joined the group. "I managed to do an initial assessment of Mrs. Sterling," he informed. "She is having a severe psychotic episode, probably triggered by untreated postpartum depression, aggravated by a history of poorly controlled bipolar disorder." "Bipolar disorder?" Richard looked at the doctor, surprised. "She never mentioned—" "Probably because she was never officially diagnosed," explained the psychiatrist. "From her reports and the notes in the notebook, the symptoms began in the adolescence. She learned to mask it very well, self-medicating with old prescriptions. It's a more common situation than we imagine, especially in people who grew up in environments where mental problems were seen as weakness. Richard remembered the few times Clara had mentioned her childhood. The rigid father, the absent mother, the constant pressure to be strong and not a problem. How many times had she swallowed her pain to appear normal? An alarm sounded inside the ICU, making everyone jump. Dr. Miller rushed inside, followed by her team. Richard stood up with a jolt, pressing his face against the glass of the door. Noah was having another seizure, his tiny body writhing in the incubator. "Pressure dropping," shouted a nurse. "He's going into kidney failure," warned another doctor. Richard felt his legs weaken. Beverly supported him, helping him to sit down again. "Have faith," she whispered. "Your son is a warrior." The next minutes were a blur of frantic activity. Doctors and nurses ran back and forth. Equipment was brought in hastily. Medical orders were shouted amidst the chaos of alarms and beeps. Dr. Miller came out briefly to get something, and Richard intercepted her. "Please," he pleaded, "tell me what's happening." The doctor hesitated for a moment. "His kidneys are shutting down," she explained gently. "We're trying one last procedure, but I need you to understand that the situation is extremely critical." "Is he going to die?" The question came out as a strangled whisper. "We're doing everything we can, but—" She paused, choosing her words. "Maybe it's time to consider preparing for the worst." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. No, it couldn't be true. The voices that tormented Clara couldn't be right. His son couldn't die, not like this, not after everything they had been through. It was then that Dr. Bennett appeared, running in the hallway. "Where's Dr. Miller? We need her in the psychiatric ward urgently." "What happened?" he asked Richard, feeling his heart clench even more. "It's Clara," replied the psychiatrist. "She had a very severe crisis. She's in a catatonic state. She doesn't respond to stimuli. She doesn't speak. She barely breathes. It's like... She knew something was happening to the baby. Richard looked from the ICU to the hallway that led to the psychiatric ward, feeling torn in two. His son was dying in one direction, and the mother of his son was losing herself in the other. How had he gotten to this point? How had everything collapsed so completely? Beverly put her hand on his shoulder. "Go see Clara," she said firmly. "I'll stay here with Noah. If anything happens, I'll let you know immediately." After a moment of hesitation, Richard nodded. He followed Dr. Bennett through the corridors of the hospital, each step seeming to weigh a ton. When they reached Clara's room, the scene he found broke his heart into 1,000 pieces. Clara was sitting on the bed, completely motionless, her eyes fixed on a distant point. Her face was wet with tears, but she didn't move to dry them. The teddy bear was still in her arms, but her hug was loose, as if she no longer had the strength to even hold it. "Clara!" Richard called softly, approaching the bed. She didn't react. She continued looking into the void, as if she were trapped in a world to which no one else had access. He sat next to her on the bed and gently took her hand. It was cold as ice. "Clara, please come back to me. Our son needs you. I need you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, very slowly, her fingers closed around his. It was such a subtle movement that it could have gone unnoticed, but for Richard, it was like a ray of hope in the midst of darkness. The beep of his cell phone broke the moment. It was a message from Beverly. "Come back quickly. Something happened." Richard ran through the corridors of the hospital with his heart in his throat, leaving Dr. Bennett caring for Clara. The way to the ICU had never seemed so long. When he finally arrived, he found a scene that left him paralyzed. The medical team was in turmoil around Noah's incubator, and in the center of it all was Beverly, with her hands pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her face. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Miller turned to him, and for the first time since it all began, there was a different gleam in her eyes. "We don't know how to explain it, but his kidneys started to respond to the treatment. Suddenly, the toxin levels started to fall. Richard needed to lean against the wall to avoid falling. It means he's fighting, completed the doctor, and he's winning the battle. His vital signs are stabilizing. His breathing is more regular. It's as if something had changed. Beverly approached Richard, wiping away tears. It was exactly at the moment when you were with Clara. The nurse said she had never seen anything like it. It was as if his body simply decided it was time to react. Richard thought about the moment when Clara had squeezed his hand, that minimal but significant gesture of connection with reality. Could it be that somehow mother and son were connected, even at a distance? Dr. Miller continued monitoring Noah's vital signs, taking notes and giving instructions to the team. "I don't want to create false hopes," she said cautiously. "We are still in a delicate situation, but if he continues to respond like this, his chances increase considerably." Richard approached the incubator, observing his son. The color had improved a little, and although he was still connected to various machines, his breathing seemed less labored. His little hands, previously clenched in tense fists, were now more relaxed. "Hey, champ," he whispered, placing his hand on the glass of the incubator. "Keep fighting, okay? Mom and Dad are here with you." Dr. Bennett appeared in the ICU, his face showing a mixture of concern and fascination. "You're not going to believe it," he said, but Clara started to react too. She came out of the catatonic state and is asking about the baby. "How is she?" asked Richard, divided between joy at Noah's improvement and concern for Clara. "Still very fragile but present," replied the psychiatrist. "It's as if something had broken the barrier that held her trapped in that state. She wants to see her son." Dr. Miller intervened. "I don't know if it's appropriate at this moment. His condition is still delicate and she needs to stabilize first." "With all due respect, Doctor," said Beverly, surprising everyone with her firmness, "but I think it's exactly what they both need. You've seen how they improved at the exact moment when there was a connection, even at a distance. Maybe it's time to trust a little less in science and a little more in love." A thoughtful silence fell over the group. It was Richard who finally spoke. "She's right. Clara needs to see Noah, and he needs to feel his mother's presence. We can't keep them apart." After a brief discussion among the doctors, they reached an agreement. Clara would be brought in a wheelchair, properly monitored for a quick visit. Dr. Bennett went to get her, while the ICU team prepared everything to receive her. When Clara entered the ICU, Richard felt his heart clench. She was pale and visibly sedated, but her eyes, those eyes that had always enchanted him, were more lucid than in the last hours. She was still hugging the teddy bear, but now she held it as if it were a source of strength, no longer a shield against the world. "Noah," she whispered when the wheelchair stopped next to the incubator. "My little Noah." Silent tears began to stream down her face as she watched her son. Slowly, she raised her hand and placed it on the glass of the incubator, in the same place where Richard's hand had been moments before. "Forgive me, my love," she said softly. "Mommy was sick, so sick. But now everything will be okay. You are strong, so strong, just like your father." As if responding to his mother's voice, Noah stirred slightly in the incubator. His little fingers opened and closed, and for a brief moment his eyes opened, for the first time since he had been admitted. Dr. Miller approached quickly to examine him. "Impressive," she murmured, checking the monitors. "The vital signs are even better. It's almost as if he knew his family is complete now," completed Beverly, smiling through tears. Clara looked at Richard, who had knelt next to her wheelchair. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "for everything, for the secrets, for the suffering I caused." "Shh," Richard interrupted her gently. "It's not time for that. Now is the time to heal, to rebuild. All of us." The Dr. Bennett approached, checking Clara's vital signs. "I think that's enough for today," he said gently. "You need to rest, Clara. And I promise you can come back to see Noah tomorrow, if you continue to improve." Clara nodded, but before they took her away, she held Richard's hand. "You'll stay with him. I won't leave his side for even a second," Richard promised. "And tomorrow, when you come back, we'll celebrate every little victory together." As he watched Clara being taken back to the psychiatric ward, Richard felt something different in his chest. It was no longer just fear or guilt, but a kind of hope. A fragile hope, it's true, like everything in that situation, but still hope. He returned to his post next to the incubator, watching Noah, who was now sleeping more peacefully. The machines continued beeping, the doctors continued monitoring, but something had changed. It was as if a small light had been lit at the end of the tunnel, showing that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way out of that darkness. 2 hours ago, I was preparing to lose you both, he murmured, more to himself than to his son. Now I'm starting to believe that we can overcome this, together. The night continued its vigil over the hospital, but for the first time since that whole nightmare had begun, Richard felt he could breathe a little easier. There was still a long road ahead. Noah's recovery would be slow, and Clara would need a lot of support and treatment. But now he knew he wasn't alone in this battle. Beverly, who had been quietly observing everything, placed her hand on his shoulder. "You know," she said with a soft smile, "in all my years working with children, I've learned one thing. Sometimes the greatest miracles happen when we least expect them, and sometimes what seems to be our greatest tragedy ends up being the beginning of our greatest blessing." Richard looked at her, then at Noah, and finally at the hallway, through which Clara had left. Maybe Beverly was right. Maybe that terrible night, which had begun with an abandoned baby in his car, was actually the beginning of something new. Not just for Noah, but for all of them. The dawn brought a new energy to the hospital. Richard, who had dozed off in the chair next to the incubator, woke up with the gentle touch of a nurse on his shoulder. "Mr. Sterling, Dr. Miller wants to talk to you," she said gently. He stood up, feeling every muscle in his body protest after the sleepless night. Before leaving, he checked Noah. The baby was sleeping peacefully, his breathing more regular than the night before. Dr. Miller was waiting for him in her office, accompanied by another doctor who introduced himself as Dr. Davis, a specialist in neonatology. The two had serious expressions, but not as alarmed as before. "Noah's latest tests show a significant improvement in kidney function," began Dr. Miller, showing some papers. "The toxins are being eliminated gradually, and the organs are responding well to treatment. But," continued Dr. Davis, "we still have a long battle ahead. The combination of medications he received through breast milk has caused damage that may have long-term consequences." Richard felt his stomach churn. What kind of consequences? "It's early to say for sure," replied the doctor. "There may be developmental delays, motor coordination problems, even cognitive issues. We will need to monitor him very closely in the coming months, perhaps years." The news hit Richard like a punch to the gut, but before he could fully process it, a nurse rushed into the room. "Patient Clara Sterling is having a crisis in the psychiatric ward," she informed. "Dr. Bennett requested your urgent presence." Richard stood up with a jolt, but Dr. Miller prevented him from leaving. "Let us take care of this. You need to stay with Noah. He still needs his father very much." Reluctantly, Richard agreed. He returned to the ICU, where he found Beverly, who had arrived early, bringing a change of clean clothes for him. "How is she?" he asked as they headed to the bathroom so he could change. "She spent the night restless," replied Beverly. The nurses said she had nightmares calling for Noah. In the early morning, she started hearing the voices again. Richard closed, his eyes feeling the weight of exhaustion and worry. As he changed, his mind wandered between Noah and Clara, both fighting their own battles in different wards of the same hospital. When he returned to the ICU, he found Dr. Bennett waiting for him. The psychiatrist looked tired, but not alarmed. Clara had an episode of severe anxiety, he explained. The voices came back strongly, saying that Noah was getting worse, that she needed to save him. We managed to contain her in time and adjust the medication. She tried to do something? Richard asked, fearing the answer. She tried to run out of the room to come here, replied the doctor. But the most worrying thing were the hallucinations. She said she could see shadows approaching Noah, that she needed to protect him. Richard slumped into the chair, feeling the weight of it all. It was as if every small progress came with a new challenge. Mr. Sterling, continued Dr. Bennett, sitting next to him, we need to talk about Clara's treatment in the long term. What she's facing is not something that can be resolved in a few days. What exactly does she have, doctor? Asked Richard. I mean, besides bipolar disorder? We are dealing with a complex picture, explained the psychiatrist. The untreated bipolar disorder for so long has created a severe psychological vulnerability. When she got pregnant, the hormonal changes aggravated the situation. The stress of childbirth, added to the constant fear of losing the baby as she had lost the others, triggered a case of postpartum psychosis. And is there treatment? Yes, but it's a long process. We need to first stabilize the acute condition with medication. Then she'll need intensive therapy to work through the traumas, especially those related to the previous losses that she never processed properly. Richard nodded, trying to absorb all the information. At that moment, a commotion caught his attention. Noah had woken up and was stirring in the incubator, his little fingers opening and closing as if looking for something. The nurse approached to check on him and smiled. He's stronger today, she said. He even tried to cry earlier, which is a great sign. Richard approached the incubator, observing every little movement of his son. It was amazing how such a small creature could be so strong. Doctor, he called without taking his eyes off Noah, would it be possible to bring Clara to see him again? Yesterday, when she was here, he reacted so well. Dr. Bennett exchanged a look with Dr. Miller, who had just entered the ICU. After a moment of consideration, they both agreed. We'll try, said Dr. Miller, but with some conditions. She needs to be more stable, and the visit has to be brief. I'll increase her medication a little, added Dr. Bennett. Enough to keep her calm, but not so much that it leaves her too sedated. We want her to be able to interact with the baby. While the doctors discussed the details, Beverly approached. Richard. You know, she said softly, in all these years working with abandoned children, I've learned that sometimes love is the best medicine. Clara is sick, yes, but the love for her son can be the strength she needs to heal. Richard looked at the older woman, feeling a wave of gratitude for her constant and wise presence. How do you do it? He asked. How do you manage to keep hope after seeing so many sad stories? Beverly smiled, a smile full of wisdom and compassion, because I've also seen many stories of overcoming, and because I believe that sometimes we need to go through the darkest valley to find the brightest light. At that moment, Noah began to stir more actively in the incubator, catching everyone's attention. His little eyes opened briefly, revealing a shade of brown identical to Clara's. He has his mother's eyes, murmured Richard, feeling tears forming in his own eyes. And the strength of his father, completed Beverly. The morning progressed, bringing with it a new routine of examinations, medications, and constant monitoring. But now, amidst all the worry and uncertainty, there was also a thread of hope. as tenuous as the sunlight that began to enter through the hospital windows, but equally persistent and vital. The middle of the afternoon brought a temporary calm to the neonatal ICU. Noah had just been fed through the feeding tube and was sleeping peacefully. Richard took advantage of the moment to try to eat something, convinced by Beverly that he needed to maintain his own strength. It was then that Dr. Bennett appeared with news from Clara. "She's more lucid now," informed the psychiatrist. "The new medication seems to be taking effect. The voices have diminished, and she can better distinguish reality from hallucinations." "Can I see her?" asked Richard, abandoning the half-eaten sandwich. The doctor nodded. "Actually, I came to get you for that. She asked about you. I think she's ready to talk about everything that happened." Richard followed the doctor to the psychiatric ward, his heart beating faster with each step. He found Clara sitting in an armchair near the window of her room. She looked different, still pale and visibly tired, but her eyes were more focused, more present. "Hi," he said softly, approaching. Clara looked up at him, and Richard saw tears forming. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." He pulled a chair and sat down in front of her. "You don't need to apologize. You were sick. You still are, but now you're getting help." "I should have told you earlier," she said, clutching the teddy bear she still kept with her. "About the other babies, about the voices, about everything." "Why didn't you?" asked Richard gently. Clara was silent for a moment, as if organizing her thoughts. "In the beginning, I thought I could control it. I always controlled it, you know. Since I was little, I learned to hide when I wasn't feeling well. My father said that depression was nonsense, that all it took was willpower." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "When I lost the first baby, the voices started as whispers. They said it was my fault, that I didn't deserve to be a mother. I tried to ignore them, to focus on work, to be the perfect wife you deserved." "Clara," interrupted Richard, "I never wanted a perfect wife. I wanted you with all your complexities. Forgive me for not realizing how much you were suffering." "You were busy building your empire," she said, without resentment in her voice. "And I didn't want to be a burden. When I lost the second baby, the voices got louder. I started taking the old medications, those that the psychiatrist had prescribed in adolescence. I thought they would solve it." "Why didn't you seek help when you found out you were pregnant again?" Clara hugged the teddy bear tighter. "I was afraid. The voices said that if I told someone, the baby would die faster. They showed me visions of him dying every night. It was so real, Richard, so real." Her words were interrupted by sobs. Richard moved instinctively to hug her, but she stopped him with a gesture. "I need to finish," she said, wiping away the tears. "I need you to understand. When Noah was born, I thought the voices would stop, but they got even stronger. They told me he was cursed, that he wouldn't live more than 2 days. I tried to fight them, I swear I tried." "Was that why you left him in my car?" Clara nodded slowly. "The voices said it was his only chance, that you were strong, that you could save him as I couldn't. I really believed I was doing the right thing." Richard felt his own heart break, seeing the pain in her eyes. "And now? Are the voices still there?" "They're lower," she replied. "The medications that Dr. Bennett prescribed are different, stronger. Sometimes I still hear them, but I can tell they're not real." Dr. Bennett, who had remained discreetly in the corner of the room, approached. "Clara is making remarkable progress," he said. "The treatment is only just beginning, but her response to the medication is promising." "When can I see Noah again?" asked Clara, a note of anxiety in her voice. "If you continue to be stable like this, we can try tomorrow," replied the psychiatrist. "But we need to take it slow. Your recovery is as important as his." At that moment, Richard's phone rang. It was Beverly, her voice urgent. "Come quickly! Noah is having a strange reaction to the medications." Richard stood up with a jolt, but before he could leave, Clara grabbed his arm. Her eyes were wide with fear. "It's him, isn't it? Something happened to Noah." "Calm down," said Richard, trying to keep his own voice controlled. "I'll check and come back to tell you, okay?" But Clara was already standing, trembling. The voices, they were right. He's going to die like the others. Dr. Bennett quickly approached with a nurse, trying to calm Clara, who was beginning to panic. Richard was divided between staying and running to see his son. "Go," said the psychiatrist. "We'll take care of her here." Richard ran through the corridors of the hospital, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived at the ICU, he found a medical team around. Noah's incubator. The baby's body was arched as if he felt pain. "What happened?" Until he asked, desperate. Dr. Miller turned to him, her expression worried but controlled. "He's having an adverse reaction to one of the medications. We'll need to make some adjustments to the treatment." "But will he be okay?" "We're doing everything we can," she replied, turning her attention back to the baby. "For now, he's stable, but we need to monitor him closely." The next hours were torture. Richard alternated between watching the doctors working on Noah and receiving updates about Clara, who had to be sedated after having a severe panic attack. It was already night when the situation finally stabilized. Noah had responded well to the change in medication, and his vital signs were normalizing. Clara was sleeping under the effect of the sedatives, but Dr. Bennett assured that it was a peaceful sleep without nightmares. Beverly, who had remained by Richard's side throughout the crisis, put her hand on his shoulder. "You need to rest. A little. I'll stay with him." Richard shook his head. "I can't. I promised I wouldn't leave his side." "Then at least sit down," she insisted. "It doesn't help anyone if you get sick too." Reluctantly, Richard settled into the chair next to the incubator. He watched his son sleeping, so small and fragile, but at the same time so strong. He thought about Clara, alone in her room in the psychiatric ward, fighting her own demons. "How are we going to get through all this?" he murmured, more to himself than to Beverly. "One day at a time," she replied softly. "One small miracle at a time." And as if responding to her words, Noah opened his eyes at that moment, his gaze meeting his father's through the glass of the incubator. It was a look so intense, so full of life, that Richard felt tears stream down his face. "That's it, son," he whispered. "Keep fighting. Mom and Dad are here with you." The first rays of sunlight began to enter through the hospital windows when Dr. Miller convened a meeting with Richard and the medical team. Tiredness was etched on everyone's faces after another night of vigil, but there was also a renewed determination. "Noah's latest tests showed a considerable improvement in kidney function," began the doctor, spreading several papers on the table. "However, we discovered something that worries us." Richard felt his heart race. What was it? "The toxins from the medications have affected his nervous system more than we initially thought," she explained, pointing to some examination images. "We are detecting small changes in his brain activity." "What does that mean?" asked Richard, his voice trembling slightly. Dr. Davis, the neonatologist, leaned forward. "It means we need to be even more aggressive in the treatment. We will need to do a series of procedures to try to minimize permanent damage." "Permanent damage?" Richard repeated the words as if they were physically painful. "There is a possibility of neurological sequelae," confirmed the doctor. "Developmental delays, motor difficulties, learning problems. It is impossible to predict for sure at this moment." Richard sank into the chair, feeling the weight of those words. It was then that Dr. Bennett, who also participated in the meeting, intervened. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," he said. "Clara is showing significant improvement with the new treatment, and I believe it would be beneficial for both to establish more regular contact between mother and son." But didn't she have a crisis yesterday? Questioned Richard, remembering the panic episode. Yes, but the crisis was different from the previous ones, explained the psychiatrist. This time, she managed to distinguish between the voices and reality. Even at the height of the panic, a part of her knew that the voices were not real. That is an important progress. Dr. Miller seemed hesitant. I don't know if it's prudent, considering Noah's delicate condition. With all due respect, Doctor, interrupted Beverly, who had arrived silently during the discussion. But don't you think it's time to trust a little more in the power of maternal love? Everyone turned to her, surprised by her intervention. Beverly continued, her voice soft but firm. I've spent years working with mothers in vulnerable situations. I've seen cases that medicine couldn't explain, children who recovered against all odds when they received the love and care they needed. Dr. Bennett nodded. She's right. The bond between mother and son can be a powerful force of healing for both. After a long discussion, they reached an agreement. Clara would be allowed to visit Noah for short periods, always supervised and, with the medication properly adjusted. The first visit would be that same morning. Richard went to pick up Clara in her room, found her sitting on the bed, already dressed and combed, clearly anxious but trying to stay calm. Are you ready? He asked gently. She nodded, clutching the already familiar teddy bear to her chest. The voices, they are quieter today. The new medications are different. They make me feel more present. That's good, he said, offering his arm to help her up. Noah needs his mother present. The walk to the ICU was silent, each step filled with expectation and apprehension. When they arrived, they found Beverly next to the incubator, singing softly to Noah. Look who came to see you, little warrior, she said gently, stepping aside to make room for Clara. Clara approached slowly, as if fearing that any sudden movement could hurt her son. Her eyes filled with tears as she saw the various tubes and machines connected to the small body. Can I touch him? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Miller, who supervised everything closely, nodded. You can put your hand through the opening of the incubator. You just need to sanitize it first. With trembling hands, Clara followed the doctor's instructions. When she finally touched her son's soft skin, something extraordinary happened. Noah, who was sleeping, opened his eyes and turned his little face towards the touch of his mother. Hi, my love, said Clara, tears streaming freely down her face. Mommy is here. Forgive me for not being here before, but now I'm here and I'm not going to leave you alone anymore. As if responding, Noah moved his little hand and grabbed Clara's finger. The heart monitor registered a small change. His beats became stronger, more regular. Impressive, murmured Dr. Miller, observing the monitors. His vital signs are improving just with the contact. Richard watched the scene with a heavy heart. Seeing Clara and Noah together, connected by that simple but profound touch, made him realize how much time and energy he had wasted worrying about things that now seemed so insignificant. Money, status, power. Dr. Bennett approached Richard discreetly. Look at her, he said softly. See how her eyes are different, more focused, more present. That's how we know the treatment is working. Clara began to sing softly to Noah, an old lullaby that her grandmother used to sing. Her voice, although still weak and a little shaky, carried an emotion that touched everyone present. Did you know that she sang that same song at the daycare? Commented Beverly, wiping away a tear. The children loved it. She has a special gift with the little ones. The moment was interrupted by a small alarm. It was time for Noah's medication. Clara was startled by the noise, but this time she didn't panic. It's okay, assured the nurse. It's just time for his medicine. What medicine? Asked Clara, and for the first time her tone was of genuine interest, not of fear or guilt. Dr. Miller took the opportunity to explain the treatment, surprising herself with the lucidity of Clara's questions. It was as if contact with her son had awakened an inner strength that she herself didn't know. "I think that's enough for today," said Dr. Bennett after some time. "We don't want to overdo it on the first day." Clara nodded, understanding. Before moving away from the incubator, she leaned in and whispered to Noah, "Mommy will be back tomorrow, my love. Be strong, okay? Now we are in this battle together." As Richard accompanied Clara back to her room, he noticed that she walked differently. Her steps were firmer, her posture more erect. It was as if that brief visit had restored some of her dignity. "Thank you," she said when they reached the room, "for not giving up on us." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "I'll never give up on you, Clara. Never again." The days at the hospital began to follow a new routine. Every morning, Clara visited Noah for a few hours, always under the careful supervision of the medical team. With each visit, it was possible to notice small changes in both mother and son. Clara was more present, more connected with reality, while Noah responded better and better to the treatments. One particularly sunny morning, while Clara sang softly to her son, Dr. Miller noticed something interesting on the monitors. "Look at this," she called, pointing to the numbers. "Every time Clara sings, his heart rate stabilizes and his saturation improves." Dr. Bennett, who observed the scene, smiled. It's fascinating how the maternal bond can influence physical recovery. Clara is also responding extraordinarily well to the treatment since we started these regular visits. Richard, who rarely left the side of the incubator, realized that it was true. Clara's crises had decreased significantly, and even when the voices returned, she was able to distinguish them from reality more clearly. "Do the voices still appear?" he asked Clara later when they were having coffee in the hospital hallway. She nodded, but her face did not show the same fear as before. "Yes, but it's different now. It's as if I could choose not to. Believe them, the medications help, and having Noah nearby too. When I'm with him, the voices almost disappear completely." It was at this moment that Beverly appeared, carrying a small box. "I brought some things from the daycare," she said. "The children made drawings for Noah and for you, Clara." Clara took the drawings with slightly trembling hands. They were colored scribbles, typical of small children, some with messages written by Beverly: "Get well soon, come back soon, we miss you." "They miss you," said Beverly softly. "Especially Miguel, that little boy that you always calm down when—" he cried. Tears began to stream down Clara's face. "I miss them too, the daycare, the songs, the stories. It was the only place where I felt useful, you know? Where the voices couldn't convince me that I was a failure." Richard felt his heart clench. How many times had Clara tried to find her place in the world, while he was too busy building his empire to notice? The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the ICU. One of Noah's alarms had gone off, causing everyone to run inside. The baby was having a new seizure, although less severe than the previous ones. "We need to adjust the medication again," said Dr. Miller, working quickly with her team. "His nervous system is still very sensitive." Clara, who would normally panic at any change in Noah's condition, surprised everyone by keeping calm. She approached the incubator and, even with trembling hands, began to sing softly. Gradually, the monitors began to show an improvement. The movements, convulsing movements, decreased, and Noah's breathing normalized to the sound of his mother's voice. "Extraordinary," murmured Dr. Davis, the neonatologist. "I've never seen such a clear response to maternal contact." Later, during the daily meeting of the medical team, they discussed the next steps of the treatment. The most recent tests showed a significant improvement in Noah's kidney function, but concerns about possible neurological sequelae persisted. "We need to start thinking about the long term," said Dr. Davis. "Even if we can completely stabilize his condition, we still have a long road ahead in terms of rehabilitation and development monitoring." "What about Clara?" asked Richard, worried about how she would deal with this reality. Dr. Bennett adjusted his glasses before answering. "Clara is progressing well, but she will also need ongoing monitoring. The treatment of bipolar disorder is for life, and she will still have to work hard in therapy to process all the traumas. But she has shown a surprising strength," he added. "The way she handled today's crisis shows how much progress we've already made. A few weeks ago, an episode like that would have triggered a severe psychotic crisis. Beverly, who participated in the meetings as an observer, raised an important question. And when they are discharged, what is going to happen?" It was a question that everyone avoided, but that needed to be discussed. Clara and Noah's situation was complex. She would need constant supervision for some time, and the baby would need special care. "Can't I take them to my house?" suggested Richard. "I can hire nurses, adapt a room." "It's not that simple," interrupted Dr. Bennett. "Clara needs to develop her independence gradually. Putting her directly in a situation of total dependence would not be healthy for her recovery. And there's also the legal issue," reminded Sarah, the social worker. "Technically, you are still divorced, and considering the recent history—" Richard ran his hands over his face, frustrated. How could they keep Clara and Noah together, giving them the necessary support without compromising the recovery of either of them? It was then that Beverly cleared her throat softly. "I have a suggestion," she said. "The house next to the daycare is vacant. It's small but comfortable. Clara could live there, close enough to have supervision, but with space to develop her autonomy. And during the day, while she does her treatment, Noah could stay at the daycare, where we already have experience with children who need special care." Everyone in the room considered the idea. It was a solution that could work. Clara would have her own space but would not be alone. Noah would receive the necessary care, and both would have a close support network. "I could buy the house," offered Richard immediately. "Renovate, adapt." "No," interrupted Beverly gently. "You can help, of course, but let it be something simple. Clara needs to rebuild her life little by little, not be transported to an artificial reality of luxury." Richard was about to protest, but he realized that she was right. His tendency to want to solve everything with money had not helped Clara in the past. Why would it help now? The meeting continued for some time, discussing practical details and establishing a gradual transition plan. When it finally ended, Richard returned to the ICU, finding Clara still next to Noah's incubator. "He's stronger today," she said without taking her eyes off her son. "I can feel it." Richard watched the two, feeling his heart clench in a different way, no longer from fear or guilt, but from a kind of cautious hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would be able to find a way through all that suffering. The news of the possible move to the house next to the daycare brought a new light to Clara's eyes. During her morning visit to Noah, she spoke animatedly about her plans, always keeping a hand gently supported inside the incubator, in contact with her son. "Beverly said there's a small garden in the back," she told Richard, who watched as her face lit up when talking about the future. "I can plant some flowers, maybe even some herbs. I always wanted to have a garden, you know. But in the apartment—" She stopped suddenly, her expression changing. Richard knew that look. It was what she always did when the difficult memories returned. "What was it?" he asked softly. "In the apartment," she continued after a moment, "the voices said that I would kill anything I tried to grow, that not even plants would survive my care." Richard felt his heart clench. How many times had Clara tried to share her dreams with him, and how many times had he been too busy to listen? "This time, it will be different," he said. "You are no longer alone in this battle." At that moment, Noah stirred in the incubator, his little hand seeking Clara's touch. She smiled, the shadows leaving her eyes instantly. "Look," she said, "I think someone agrees with his dad." Dr. Miller, who was doing her morning rounds, approached to examine Noah. "The latest tests are promising," she informed. "Kidney function is almost normalized and the seizures have decreased significantly, but..." "But?" asked Richard, feeling his heart race. "But we are still concerned about the neurological signs," she completed. "The responses to some stimuli are not completely adequate for his age." Clara squeezed Richard's hand. "What does that mean exactly?" The doctor sighed, choosing her words carefully. "It means we need to prepare for the possibility of developmental delays. He may take longer to reach some milestones, such as sitting, crawling, speaking. But he will be able to, won't he?" asked Clara, her voice trembling slightly. "Will he be able to do those things eventually?" "With adequate therapy and a lot of stimulation, yes," replied Dr. Miller. "But each case is unique. We cannot predict exactly what his development will be like." Richard watched Clara processing the information. In the past, news like that would have triggered a severe crisis. Now, although clearly shaken, she maintained her composure. "Then we will do everything that is necessary," she said finally. "All the therapies, all the treatments. I will not leave my son alone in this fight." Dr. Bennett, who had entered silently during the conversation, smiled as he heard Clara's words. It was exactly the type of response that demonstrated the progress of her treatment, realistic but determined. "Clara is ready to start discussing the transition home," he said later, during a private conversation with Richard. "The treatment is working better than we expected. The voice is still, but she has developed healthy coping mechanisms to manage them." "Isn't it too soon?" Richard asked, concerned. "Actually, it's the perfect time," Dr. Bennett replied. "She is stable enough to start regaining her autonomy, yet still vulnerable enough to accept help and supervision. And the prospect of having her own place near the daycare and people who support her is serving as a strong motivator for her recovery." Beverly, who had arrived for her daily visit, brought more encouraging news. "The children at Sunny Corner Daycare are so excited about Clara living nearby," she said. "They're already making plans to help decorate the house, making drawings for Noah's room." Richard smiled, remembering how Clara always spoke so fondly of the daycare children. She really found her place there, didn't she? "Yes," Beverly confirmed. "You know, sometimes life takes us down strange paths to show us where we're really meant to be. Clara always had this special gift with children, this sensitivity. Maybe all this suffering was her way of discovering her true calling." That afternoon, while Clara rested after her therapy session, Richard went with Beverly to see the house. It was a simple but welcoming structure, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. The backyard, though in need of care, had the potential to become the space Clara dreamed of. "I'll need to do some repairs," he said, noticing some areas that needed maintenance. "But nothing too fancy, I promise." Beverly smiled, approving. "The important thing is that it's a safe and welcoming place. A place where she can rebuild her life and raise her son with dignity." When they returned to the hospital, they found Clara awake and eager to see Noah. On the way to the NICU, she shared some ideas she had discussed in her therapy session. "I was thinking about going back to school," she said timidly. "Maybe taking a course in early childhood education." Dr. Bennett thinks that having goals like that can help with my recovery. Richard felt a wave of pride and admiration for her. How had he not noticed before the strength that existed behind that apparent fragility? Upon arriving at the NICU, they were greeted by a surprise. Noah was awake and more active than usual, his little eyes following the movements around the incubator. "Look who's curious today," said the nurse, smiling. "He's been like this all afternoon, super attentive to everything. Clara immediately positioned herself beside her son, placing her hand through the opening of the incubator. As always, Noah reacted to her touch, turning his little face towards her. "Hi, my love," she whispered. "Mummy has so many plans for us. We're going to have a little house, you know, with a garden full of flowers, and you're going to grow up strong and happy in your own way, in your own time. Because you are special, my son, so special." Richard watched the scene, feeling his eyes fill with tears. It was amazing how love could transform people, how it could heal wounds that seemed impossible to heal. Night fell outside, but inside that NICU, a new light began to shine. The light of hope, of new beginnings, of the possibility of a future different from what they had imagined, but no less valuable for it. The week began with news that filled everyone with hope. After nearly a month of hospitalization, Noah was finally strong enough to breathe without the aid of machines. Dr. Miller decided to begin the process of weaning him off mechanical ventilation, a crucial step in his recovery. "It's a delicate process," she explained to Clara and Richard. "We'll do it gradually, observing how he responds. If all goes well, in a few days, he may be able to breathe completely on his own." Clara, who now spent most of the day in the NICU, watched every little movement of her son with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Her own therapy sessions had progressed to the point where Dr. Bennett allowed her to spend longer periods with Noah. "The voices still come sometimes," she confessed during one of her conversations with Richard. "But now it's different. It's like I can choose not to listen. Like I finally understand that they are part of my illness, not reality." Richard realized that Clara was different. It wasn't just the medication or the therapy. There was a new strength in her, a determination that came from her, love for her son, and the discovery of her own worth. It was during one of these afternoons in the NICU that something extraordinary happened. Clara was singing softly to Noah, as she always did, when he opened his eyes and, for the first time, smiled. "Richard," she called, her voice trembling with emotion. "He smiled. Did you see?" The nurse who was monitoring the case approached quickly. "That's wonderful," she exclaimed, making some notes. "It's an important milestone in neurological development." The news spread quickly throughout the hospital. Dr. Miller and Dr. Davis came to examine Noah, confirming that the smile was indeed a social response, not just a reflex. "It's an excellent sign," said Dr. Davis. "It shows that despite the challenges we still have ahead, his social and emotional development is progressing." Beverly, who had arrived for her daily visit, brought more exciting news. The house next to the daycare was almost ready to receive Clara and Noah. Richard had personally supervised the renovations, keeping everything simple but welcoming, exactly as they had planned. "The children helped decorate Noah's room," Beverly said, showing photos on her cell phone. "They made a painting on the wall with their little hands. Each one chose a different color. It's beautiful." Clara looked at the photos with tears in her eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Better than any luxury mansion could be." Richard, observing the scene, felt a pang of regret as he remembered the luxurious apartment where they lived during their marriage. How many times had Clara tried to make that place more welcoming, more personal, and he had insisted on keeping everything elegant and minimalist? Dr. Bennett chose this moment for his daily visit. He watched Clara for a few minutes before making his announcement. "I think it's time we started planning your discharge." Everyone in the room turned to him. Clara instinctively squeezed Richard's hand. "Don't worry," continued the psychiatrist, noting the tension. "It will be a gradual process. First, you'll spend a few hours at the house, then a longer period, until you feel completely safe to stay full-time." "And what about Noah?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Miller, who had joined the group, replied, "He's progressing well too. If he continues like this, In a few weeks, we may be able to consider his discharge as well, of course, with all the necessary follow-up. It was then that Sarah, the social worker, raised an important issue. We need to discuss the issue of guardianship. Legally, you are still divorced. We can resolve that, Richard interrupted quickly. Clara, if you agree, we can file for joint custody. That way, legally, we will both be responsible for all decisions related to Noah. Clara looked at him, surprised. You trust me with that? After everything that's happened? I trust you, he replied without hesitation. You're an amazing mother, Clara. You're fighting, getting treatment, thinking about the future. And more importantly, you love our son unconditionally. Dr. Bennett smiled, approving. That's exactly the kind of support Clara needs at this time. A strong support network, but one that also recognizes her autonomy and capability. The following days were filled with intense preparation. Clara began taking short visits to the house, always accompanied by Beverly. Each time she stayed a little longer, exploring the rooms, imagining what her life would be like there with Noah. The backyard was beginning to come to life. Richard had hired a gardener to clean up the space, but left the planting to Clara. She had already chosen some seedlings of flowers and aromatic herbs, planning to create a therapeutic environment where she could reconnect with herself. You know what I like most here? She said to Richard during one of those visits. The sound of the children playing at Sunny Corner Daycare. It's like constant music, full of life and joy. Noah also continued to progress. He could now breathe, practically on his own, and his smiles became more frequent, especially when he heard Clara's voice. Tests showed constant improvement, although doctors continued to warn about the need for long-term specialized care. He'll need physical therapy, occupational therapy, early intervention, explained Dr. Davis during a meeting. His development will likely be slower in some areas, but with proper support, he can reach his full potential. Clara absorbed all this information with a serenity that surprised everyone. We'll do everything that's needed, she said, one step at a time, at his pace. One afternoon, while watching Noah sleep peacefully in the incubator, Richard realized something important. That situation, which had started as a tragedy, had turned into an opportunity for redemption for all of them. Sometimes, said Beverly, as if reading his thoughts, we need to get completely lost to find our true path. Clara, who was changing Noah's diaper with increasing skill, smiled upon hearing this. You know what's funny? She said. The voices always told me that I didn't deserve to be happy, that I wouldn't be able to take care of anyone. But here I am, learning to take care of my son, making plans for the future. And the voices? Richard asked gently. They still come sometimes, she admitted. But now I have other voices to listen to. The laughter of the children at Sunny Corner Daycare, your words of support, and especially the little sounds that Noah makes when he's happy. Those are the voices I choose to listen to now. 6 months had passed since that rainy night when Richard found Noah in his car. Autumn arrived gently in the city, bringing with it a fresh breeze that made the curtains in Clara's house dance, gently. The garden she had planted was blooming, filling the air with delicate perfumes and attracting butterflies that enchanted the children at the daycare. On that special morning, Clara was preparing for an important moment. It was the day Noah would finally be discharged from the hospital. The last few months had been one of constant progress, though not always easy. The baby would still need special care and regular medical follow-up, but he was strong enough to go home. Is everything ready? Asked Beverly, helping Clara organize the last details in Noah's room. The space was simple but welcoming, with the walls decorated with colorful drawings made by the children from Sunny Corner Daycare. I think so, Clara replied, adjusting once again the crib that Richard had carefully chosen, safe and comfortable, without being ostentatious. The doctors said he'll need constant monitoring in the first few weeks. And that's why we set up a schedule, Beverly reminded her gently. I'll stay during the day while you do your therapy sessions, and at night, Richard will come to help. You're not alone in this, honey. Clara smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. Her own treatment had progressed significantly. The voices still appeared occasionally, but she had developed effective tools to deal with them. Dr. Bennett was proud of her progress, although he always reminded her that recovery was an ongoing process. Richard arrived shortly after, bringing the latest medical equipment they would need to have at home. In recent months, he had completely transformed. The arrogant businessman had given way to a more sensitive and present man who had learned to value what really mattered in life. "Ready?" he asked, noticing how nervous Clara seemed. "Almost," she replied, picking up the already familiar teddy bear that had been her constant companion during the hospitalization. "I just need a moment." Clara walked to the garden, her refuge in moments of anxiety. The flowers she had planted, the daisies, geraniums, and lavender, swayed gently in the morning breeze. This small green space had become her healing place, where she could reconnect with herself when things got difficult. From the daycare next door came the joyful voices of children playing. Clara had returned to help there a few hours a week, part of her process of gradual reintegration into normal life. The children adored her, and she found that her love for them was an inexhaustible source of strength and motivation. "Shall we go?" Richard called gently. "Dr. Miller is waiting for us." The drive to the hospital was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at the NICU, they were greeted by an emotional team. In recent months, everyone there had become a kind of extended family. Noah was awake in his crib. He had been out of the incubator for a few weeks. His brown eyes, so like Clara's, sparkled as he saw his mother. He was still smaller than normal for his age and would need special therapies to help with his development, but his smiles became more frequent every day. "Hello, my love," whispered Clara, carefully picking him up. "Today is a special day. We're going home." Dr. Miller approached with the final exams. "The results are stable," she reported. "Of course, we still have a long way to go, but Noah is a true warrior, and he has an amazing family to support him." Dr. Bennett, who had come especially for this moment, smiled as he saw Clara with her son. "Remember when you first came here?" he asked gently. "Look how much you've progressed, Clara, how much you both have progressed." Clara nodded, remembering the dark days when the voices dominated her, when she believed that her son was cursed. "Sometimes I'm still scared," she admitted. "But now I know it's normal to be scared. The important thing is not to let it paralyze us." While they signed the discharge papers, Beverly organized a little surprise. When they left the hospital, they found the children from Sunny Corner Daycare waiting in the garden, each holding a flower. Miguel, the little boy that Clara always calmed, was the first to approach. "Welcome home, Noah," he said, offering a yellow daisy he had picked from Clara's garden. Tears ran freely down Clara's face, but this time they were tears of joy. Richard, by her side, was also emotional. "Shall we go home?" he asked softly. The ride back was different from the ride there. The children sang songs that Clara had taught them, filling the air with joy. When they arrived at the house, they found the garden decorated with colorful ribbons and more flowers. "We made a welcome home party," Miguel announced proudly. Clara carried Noah inside, showing him every corner of the house that would be his home. The room decorated with love, the flower garden, the window overlooking the daycare. Every detail had been thought out to create an environment of healing and growth. "You know," said Richard, watching Clara settle Noah in his crib, "I never imagined that night at the stoplight would change our lives this way." Clara smiled, adjusting the teddy bear next to her son. Sometimes we need to go through the worst moment of our lives to find our true strength. Beverly, who was organizing Noah's medications on the dresser, added, and sometimes what seems like a curse is actually a blessing in disguise. The children played in the garden, their laughter entering through the window like music. Noah, in his crib, smiled at the sound of familiar voices. Clara, sitting in the rocking chair that Richard had bought, watched her little miracle with eyes full of love. The voices that once tormented her had been replaced by much sweeter sounds. The laughter of the children, the singing of the birds in the garden, the little sounds that Noah made in his sleep. It was a new symphony, one that spoke of hope, of new beginnings, of love. "Welcome home, my love," Clara whispered to Noah, who was already falling asleep. "Our journey is just beginning." And so in that simple house next to the daycare, with a flower garden and hearts full of hope, a new story began to be written. A story of overcoming, of healing, of unconditional love. A story that proved that even in the darkest nights, there is always a light waiting to shine.